Elara's knees struck the black marble hard enough for blood to bloom beneath the torn silver fabric of her Luna gown. But the pain did not make her cry out. What stole the breath from her lungs was the sight waiting above her. Her younger sister was sitting in Elara's throne, wearing Elara's wedding robe, with Elara's Luna crown already resting upon her head, while Alpha King Kale, the man who had once sworn that anyone who forced his mate to kneel would lose the hand that touched her, stood 3 steps away and watched 2 royal guards crush his wife lower before the entire kingdom. Hundreds of warriors, nobles, elders, and foreign alphas had gone deathly silent, because only moments earlier Elara had entered the Blood Moon Hall believing she had been summoned to defend herself against an accusation of treason. Instead, she had been dragged in with silver chains around her wrists to witness her own marriage being publicly buried while she was still alive. High Elder Malrek lifted Elara's Luna ring before the crowd as though displaying the spoils of an execution, then announced that the discarded Luna would complete her removal by kissing the hand of the woman replacing her. Seraphine descended from the throne slowly, every movement wrapped in false reluctance, until the hem of Elara's own wedding robe brushed against the blood spreading beneath her sister's knees. She extended her hand, and on her finger gleamed the ring Kale had removed from the sacred altar less than an hour earlier. Elara did not look at Seraphine. She looked only at her husband. Kale could still stop it. One word from him would make every guard release her, every elder fall silent, every humiliation end before it became irreversible. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled beside the sword at his hip. For one fragile second, Elara saw the man who had once carried her through a battlefield because she had twisted an ankle and refused to leave wounded soldiers behind. Then Malrek demanded obedience. The hall waited, and Kale made his choice. Lower her head. The guard seized Elara by the back of the neck. That was when something inside her stopped pleading for him. Seraphine bent closer, her beautiful face arranged into grief for everyone watching, and touched Elara's cheek as though comforting the sister whose life she had just taken apart. "Please don't make this harder," she whispered sweetly enough for the nearest nobles to hear, before lowering her voice, until only Elara could understand the words beneath it. "Do you remember telling me that patience is the difference between a beggar and a queen?" "I remembered, sister. I waited 10 years for this night." The blood in Elara's veins seemed to turn cold, because suddenly the last decade rearranged itself before her, the letters Seraphine had offered to deliver, the nights she had volunteered to sit beside Kale while Elara attended the sick, the rumors that had appeared whenever Elara left the palace, the fertility tonic Seraphine herself had insisted the royal healer prepare. This was not temptation. It was not a mistake born from forbidden affection. Her sister had not stumbled into Elara's place. She had measured it, studied it, and waited until the exact night she could take it. Then Elara felt the first violent pain tear through her abdomen. Her chained hands instinctively covered her stomach as a second cramp folded her forward, and when a drop of dark blood struck the white marble between her knees, several women in the hall gasped. The royal healer rushed from his place, but before he reached her, Seraphine's face changed. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet Elara saw it clearly, a flash of terror, not confusion, not sympathy, but the naked fear of someone watching a secret refused to stay buried. Elara lifted her eyes slowly toward her sister, and Seraphine immediately recovered, pressing one hand dramatically to her mouth. Kale finally moved from the dais. "What is wrong with her?" he demanded, but Malrek stepped between them and declared that the fallen Luna was staging another deception to destroy the coronation. The healer tried to protest. Elara's blood continued dripping onto the stone. Kale stood close enough to see it. He had one final chance to choose her. He looked at Elara. Then he looked at the crown on Seraphine's head, and he ordered the ceremony to continue. "If you believe betrayal always leaves a debt behind, stay with this story, because before the sun rose over Blackthorn, Alpha King Kale would discover that the woman he had just humiliated before an entire kingdom had disappeared, and she had taken a secret with her that could destroy his bloodline, his crown, and everything he had chosen over her. Only 3 days earlier, Elara had still believed her marriage could be saved, although the first fractures had already begun to show beneath the polished surface of Blackthorn Palace. Kale had returned from the northern campaign colder than the winter following his army, carrying a scar beneath his ribs from an ambush that had nearly killed him, and a suspicion that someone inside his own court had revealed the army's route to Frostfang. Elara had spent the night of his return outside his chamber, waiting for permission to enter, but the door never opened. Instead, Seraphine emerged shortly before dawn, carrying a basin stained with Kael's blood and wearing his black military cloak around her shoulders. When Elara asked why her sister had been inside, Seraphine answered that Kael had called for someone he could trust, and the words lodged beneath Elara's ribs, because there had once been no question whose name he would have spoken when he was wounded. The following morning, High Elder Malrek presented the first evidence of treason before the Royal Council, a letter bearing Elara's handwriting and Luna's seal, promising Frostfang access through Blackthorn's western gate on the same night Kael's forces had been ambushed. Elara demanded the parchment be examined, but Kael refused to let her touch it, claiming the evidence must remain protected until an inquiry could be completed. She stared at the seal pressed into the wax and knew immediately that something was wrong, because the crescent mark along its lower edge had been damaged 2 winters earlier and never repaired, while the impression on Malrek's letter was flawless. She tried to point this out, yet Seraphine interrupted softly, reminding the council that a second ceremonial seal existed in the Luna archives. Elara turned toward her sister in disbelief. Only 3 people knew about that seal: Elara, Kael, and Seraphine, whom Elara herself had trusted with access during her months of illness. By sunset, the accusation had multiplied. Guards claimed they had seen Elara near the western gate before the ambush. A servant swore she had burned letters after midnight. Another witness insisted Elara had privately complained that Kael's wars would leave Blackthorn without a king. Each statement was carefully shaped around a piece of truth, twisted just enough to become poison. Elara had visited the western gate because wounded refugees were arriving there. She had burned letters because they contained reports of plague from villages whose names she wanted protected from panic. She had warned Kael that continuing the northern campaign without reinforcements could get him killed. None of it mattered once Malrek arranged those fragments into a story the frightened council wanted to believe, and Kael, wounded, furious, and humiliated by the possibility that betrayal had come from his own bed, began looking at his wife as though every memory between them required re-examination. The cruelty became complete when Elara was confined to the moon chamber and denied the right to see Kael privately. For 3 days, she sent messages asking only for 10 minutes alone with him, 10 minutes without Malrek, without Seraphine, without a council, measuring every breath against political survival. Every message returned unopened. On the second night, Elara heard servants outside whisper that the king had spent hours with Seraphine discussing the future of the Luna seat. On the third morning, a guard entered carrying the silver gown reserved for formal judgment and quietly removed Elara's wedding robe from her wardrobe. She asked where it was being taken, but the guard lowered his eyes and said he had been forbidden to answer. That was the moment dread finally entered her bones, because Kael might distrust her, might even imprison her, but there was only one reason another woman would need the ceremonial robe of a living Luna. Hours later, she was marched into the Blood Moon Hall, where the truth proved uglier than anything she had imagined. Seraphine was not merely standing beside Kael. The coronation had already begun. The sacred oil had been placed on her brow. Elara's ancestral cloak hung from her shoulders. Kael had allowed the council to prepare every detail while his wife remained locked away without hearing the charges against her. Malrek declared that a kingdom surrounded by enemies could not survive under a barren Luna suspected of treason, then produced the final letter, supposedly written by Elara, stating that she would rather see Blackthorn's bloodline end than give Kael an heir. Laughter spread through one section of the nobles, cruel and relieved, because infertility had always been the easiest wound to reopen. Kael heard them call her empty, useless, incapable of giving the throne a future, yet he did not silence a single voice. After the blood appeared beneath Elara's knees, she was dragged from the hall while the coronation drums resumed behind her. Every beat followed her down the corridor like a door being slammed shut. Rowan, captain of the Royal Guard and one of the few men who had served Elara before she became Luna, intercepted them near the moon tower and ordered the escort changed under the excuse that Malrek demanded tighter security. Only after the chamber door closed did he remove Elara's chains and reveal the elderly healer hidden behind the servant's screen. The woman's name was Mara, once a physician in the Royal Medicine Wing before being dismissed for questioning orders signed by the council. She examined Elara for nearly an hour, and when she finally raised her head, her expression contained neither celebration nor comfort. Elara was pregnant. There were 2 heartbeats. One was strong, the other flickered weakly beneath the damage caused by something Elara had been swallowing for months. Mara placed one of Elara's fertility tonic bottles on the table and explained that it contained moonroot ash and small quantities of silverthorn, enough to suppress conception signs, weaken a pregnancy, and gradually create the appearance that Elara's body could not carry an heir. Elara stared at the bottle she had trusted every morning, remembering how Seraphine had personally brought the first tray after telling her that the new royal healer had found a treatment that might finally make KL happy. When Elara demanded to know who authorized the prescriptions, Mara unfolded a copied ledger and pointed to the same mark repeated beside every order, the royal seal. The discovery did not prove KL had commanded the poisoning, because Malrek and several senior officials could access the seal during wartime, but after what Elara had just endured in the hall, reason had little strength against the image of KL turning away while she bled. Rowan offered to take the evidence to the king immediately, but Elara stopped him. She had spent 3 days begging KL to hear her, and he had chosen not merely disbelief but humiliation, letting strangers push her to her knees before the sister wearing her wedding robe. If she told him about the twins now, he might stop the execution, restore her chambers, perhaps even tear the crown from Seraphine's head, but Elara would never know whether he had chosen her or simply the heirs growing inside her. She rested both hands over her abdomen as the weaker heartbeat trembled beneath Mara's touch and understood that the children had already become pieces in a war they had not been born into. Whatever KL believed about her, she would not give the council the opportunity to use them as another chain. Before the eastern sky began to pale, Rowan opened a forgotten passage concealed behind the stone hearth, once used by Luna attendants during ancient sieges. Elara took no jewels, no royal gold, and none of the gowns that had defined her life beside Kale. She removed the Luna ring from her finger, folded her blood-stained ceremonial cloak beneath it, and placed a narrow silver bracelet beside them, a bracelet Mara had found among the unfinished nursery gifts Elara had secretly commissioned months earlier when she still allowed herself to hope. 2 names were engraved inside, chosen long before she knew whether she would ever have children: Orin and Lyra. Then Elara looked once at the chamber where she had waited for Kale through wars, winters, wounds, and years of unanswered prayers, and walked into the darkness without looking back. When Kale reached the moon tower near dawn, anger came before fear. He demanded to know why the guards had received no response, ordered the door broken, and entered expecting to find Elara refusing another summons. Instead, he found an empty room, broken restraints, blood on the bed linen, her Luna ring resting on the folded cloak, and the tiny silver bracelet beside it. He picked it up without understanding the names engraved inside, but something about their size made his hand tighten. Then he saw the words written across the stone wall above the bed, dark enough to look black in the fading moonlight. You chose her before you knew what you were throwing away. Before he could call for Rowan, every bell in Blackthorn began ringing at once, not the alarm for invasion, but the ancient warning from the Moon Temple, a sound that had not been heard for generations. Coil ran. By the time he reached the temple, elders were already gathered around the sacred altar, their faces drained of color. The moon seal had gone dark. Seraphine stepped forward, wearing her new crown, and demanded that the priests reignite it, but the oldest priest backed away from her as though she carried plague. He explained that the seal was not extinguished by sabotage, nor had Elara stolen its power. The bond protecting Blackthorn had withdrawn on its own, something the old records claimed could happen only when the kingdom rejected the Luna it had truly accepted. Kale stared at Seraphine, then at the dead silver stone, while the meaning of Elara's empty chamber began tightening around him like a noose. He had chosen a new Luna before sunrise, and by sunrise, the old one was gone. By the time the first gray light of dawn reached the towers of Blackthorn, the triumph Seraphine had imagined for 10 years had already begun to rot beneath her feet, because the moment the moon seal went dark, every protective rune carved into the palace walls faded with it. The silver flames burning above the northern gates collapsed into ordinary fire, and somewhere beyond the battlements thousands of wolves began howling with such violent unrest that even the oldest soldiers crossed themselves beneath the moon goddess and refused to call it coincidence. Kale stood inside the moon temple with Elara's narrow silver bracelet still clenched in his fist, staring at the dead sacred stone while High Elder Malrek demanded that the priests restore its power before visiting alphas learned what had happened. Yet the eldest priest did not move toward the altar. Instead, he looked past Kale toward Seraphine, who had arrived wearing the Luna crown before the coronation oils had even dried against her skin, and said with enough gravity to silence the chamber, "A seal cannot be commanded to recognize what the kingdom itself has rejected." Seraphine's face hardened beneath the humiliation, but Malrek reacted faster, declaring that Elara must have corrupted the sacred bond before escaping, and that her disappearance proved the treason charges had been justified all along. Kale should have questioned the convenience of that conclusion, especially with Elara's blood still visible on the strip of fabric he had found in her abandoned chamber, yet anger offered him an easier refuge than doubt. He ordered every city gate sealed, every bridge watched, and every patrol doubled from Blackthorn to the Frostfang border, then placed a reward large enough to feed a minor pack for an entire winter on information leading to Elara's capture. The wording of the decree was colder than anything he had ever spoken about his wife. The former Luna was to be recovered alive if possible, restrained if necessary, and anyone found assisting her would be charged with treason against the crown. Seraphine watched him sign the order without blinking, while Malrek smiled almost imperceptibly, because Kale had just transformed the woman he had sworn to protect into prey hunted by the very warriors who once lowered their heads when she passed. The consequences arrived before noon. Silvercrest withdrew 200 warriors from Blackthorn's northern defense line without explanation. Ashvale suspended its grain shipments, and 3 lesser packs refused to send their heirs to the palace until the legitimacy of the new Luna could be established. Kale treated each message as another insult engineered by Elara. Yet the reports became harder to dismiss when the moongrain fields outside the eastern wall blackened within hours. The palace wolves snapped their chains whenever Seraphine approached, and the ceremonial fountain beneath the Luna balcony stopped flowing for the first time in living memory. Seraphine responded not with fear but fury, ordering servants to remove Elara's portraits from the western corridors, strip her personal crest from the council chamber, and empty the Luna apartments before sunset. When Kale passed through the courtyard later, he found servants feeding Elara's embroidered banners, old correspondence, and winter cloaks into a brazier large enough to consume years of her life in minutes, and among the flames he recognized the blue mantle she had worn when she welcomed him home from his first war. He stopped, only for a moment. One command would have saved what remained. Yet Seraphine appeared beside him, and murmured that Blackthorn could not recover, while every corridor still worshipped a traitor, and Kale, exhausted enough to mistake destruction for necessity, walked away while the fire swallowed the mantle. Behind him, one elderly maid began quietly crying because Elara had once sat beside that woman's dying son through an entire winter night when no noble had cared whether the child survived. But by evening the maid was dismissed, along with 37 servants accused of excessive loyalty to the former Luna. The palace did not become Seraphine's because she sat on Elara's throne. She began claiming it by removing everyone who remembered what Elara had been before Malrek taught the court to call her barren and treacherous. Kael saw enough to know the purge was cruel. Yet, each time conscience pressed against him, he returned mentally to the forged letters, the western gate, the ambush scar beneath his ribs, and the unbearable possibility that admitting uncertainty would mean admitting he had ordered an innocent woman onto her knees. Far beyond Blackthorn's searchlines, Elara was learning what Kale's decree meant from the opposite side of the sword. Rowan had led her through an abandoned water passage beneath the moon tower and into the forest before dawn, but blood loss and the lingering poison had reduced every mile to a battle against her own body, and twice before midday she had collapsed against trees, while Rowan listened for riders behind them. He wanted to turn west toward Silvercrest, whose alpha owed Elara an old political debt. Yet she refused to bring royal hunters toward an allied pack, while she remained accused of treason. Instead, they moved through frozen ravines toward a healer's cottage hidden among the ruined shrines of an older kingdom, where Mara believed they could remain unnoticed long enough to stabilize the weaker child. Elara carried no crown, jewels, or money beyond a few coins. Rowan had hidden inside his armor, but beneath her cloak she protected the copied medicine ledger as though it were more valuable than royal gold, because somewhere inside those pages lay the identity of the person who had poisoned her while teaching an entire kingdom to blame her body for failing. By nightfall, the weaker heartbeat had become so faint that Mara refused to continue traveling, and they sheltered inside the broken shell of a hunter's chapel, while Rowan stood guard with his sword drawn. Elara lay on a stone bench beneath a torn cloak, one hand pressed protectively over the place where 2 lives were fighting to remain. And every time she closed her eyes, she heard Kale ordering the guards to make her kneel. That memory hurt differently now because she could no longer excuse it as rage, politics, injury, or manipulation. Whatever lies had been placed before him, Kael had chosen public humiliation when private doubt was still available to him. Mara warned her that grief could worsen the bleeding, but Elara did not answer with tears or accusations, because survival had already become more urgent than heartbreak. She asked instead what quantity of silverthorn had entered her body, how long the damage could continue, whether the children could recover, and what signs would mean one heartbeat was failing, forcing Mara to look at her with the helpless respect given to someone who had been broken open and nevertheless refused to collapse where her enemies expected. The hunters found them shortly before midnight. 5 Blackthorn riders entered the ravine carrying Kael's newly issued warrant, and Rowan recognized 2 men who had served under him for years before Malrek promoted them after Elara's arrest. Their captain shouted that the former Luna was to surrender peacefully and promised Kael wanted her alive. But Elara heard the careful omission in those words. No one said unharmed. Rowan drew his sword and told them the woman they were hunting was bleeding from a royal poison, which earned only a cruel laugh from one soldier who called her a barren liar trying to escape judgment. Something inside Elara hardened at the insult, not because the word still had power over her, but because she now knew how deliberately that lie had been planted. She stepped from the ruined chapel despite Rowan's attempt to stop her and asked the soldiers whether any of them had actually seen the evidence against her examined by an independent hand. None answered. She then asked whether Kael had ordered them to return her to the palace or directly to Malrek, and the captain's hesitation told Rowan everything. The fight erupted before another word could be spoken. Rowan struck first when one soldier reached for Elara, disarming him with enough force to break the man's wrist, while Mara dragged Elara behind a collapsed altar as steel rang against stone. The captain shouted that Malrek wanted the woman alive, confirming the distinction Elara had just suspected, but another rider circled behind the chapel and nearly caught her before an arrow appeared from the darkness and buried itself through his shoulder. More arrows followed, precise enough to force the Blackthorn patrol backward without killing them, and within moments a dozen gray-cloaked warriors emerged from the forest bearing the crest of Silvercrest. Their commander removed his hood only after the last royal rider fled, revealing Alpha Ronan, a man Elara had not seen since the famine winter 4 years earlier, when she had secretly diverted grain from the palace reserves to keep his starving pack alive after the council refused aid. Ronan looked at the blood on her dress, the absence of her Luna ring, and the royal warrant dropped in the snow before saying with quiet contempt, "So this is how Blackthorn repays the woman who saved half its allies." Back at the palace, Kael's first real fracture of certainty came from a prisoner he had ordered dragged before the throne. Rowan had not been captured, as Seraphine assumed, but one of his former lieutenants had been detained after refusing to join the search, and under questioning, the man revealed that Rowan had recently taken samples of Elara's fertility tonic to an independent healer. Seraphine immediately demanded the lieutenant be executed for spreading treasonous lies, but Kael noticed how quickly she spoke and ordered the man imprisoned instead. That evening, he entered Elara's abandoned apartments alone and searched through drawers. Seraphine's servants had not yet emptied, finding empty medicine bottles hidden behind a carved chest and a small calendar where Elara had marked every dose because she had once believed discipline might eventually give him an heir. Besides several dates, she had written symptoms in tiny script: dizziness, numb fingers, blood, missed cycle. Kael read those words until his scarred hand began trembling, because some entries had been made while he was away at war, and others on nights when he remembered accusing her of avoiding his bed. Seraphine found him there and immediately insisted the notes proved nothing, reminding him that Elara had lied about the Western Gate and that desperate women often invented illnesses when they feared losing status. Kael looked at her for a long moment before asking why Elara's medicine had been ordered through the royal treatment chamber instead of the Luna infirmary. Seraphine answered too quickly that Malrek had recommended the change, then softened her tone and took Kael's hand, telling him that guilt was exactly what Elara wanted him to feel. For the first time since the coronation, Kael pulled his hand away. He did not accuse Seraphine, but something in the room shifted because she had expected his certainty to remain obedient, and he had finally begun asking questions that did not lead back to Elara's guilt. Before either could speak again, a guard announced that an elderly physician had been detained at the southern checkpoint, carrying copied treatment records under her cloak, and Kael ordered the woman brought directly to him before Malrek learned she existed. The healer was not Mara, but one of her former assistants, an exhausted woman named Vesta, whose fear intensified when she saw Seraphine standing beside the throne. Kale dismissed everyone except 2 guards and demanded the truth about Elara's medicine, but Vesta refused to speak until Seraphine was removed from the chamber. The request alone enraged the new Luna, yet Kale ordered her out, and the hatred that flashed across Seraphine's face before she obeyed was sharper than anything she had shown Elara publicly. Once the doors closed, Vesta produced a copied formula and explained that the tonic contained compounds designed to suppress fertility signs, destabilize implantation, and imitate the symptoms of a woman incapable of carrying children. Kale's blood seemed to drain from his body as she continued, because Elara had not failed to give Blackthorn an heir. Someone had been methodically preventing her from doing so while allowing him to believe the failure belonged to her. Then Vesta asked when Elara had taken her last dose. Kale did not know. The physician studied Elara's symptom calendar and counted backward under her breath, before looking up with an expression that made the room suddenly feel too small. If Elara had missed several doses during her confinement, she explained, conception could have occurred before the poison fully suppressed her body, and the bleeding Kale had witnessed in the Blood Moon Hall might not have been illness at all. Kale's fingers tightened around the edge of the table until the wood creaked beneath them. He remembered the narrow bracelet from the tower, the 2 unfamiliar names engraved inside, the blood-stained cloth beneath it, and the words Elara had left on the wall. Vesta hesitated only once before delivering the sentence that stripped the last shelter from his certainty. If she survived the night, Your Majesty, there is a very real possibility your Luna did not leave Blackthorn alone. At that exact moment, miles away beneath the protection of Silvercrest, Mara pressed 2 fingers against Elara's wrist, while another healer listened beneath her abdomen, and after several terrifying seconds the faint rhythm returned beside the stronger one. Elara closed her eyes but did not allow herself to break. While Ronan stood outside the chamber reading Kale's warrant by firelight and learning that Blackthorn had officially branded its missing Luna a traitor, he folded the decree once, held it above the flame, and watched the Alpha King's seal burn into ash before ordering every Silvercrest border closed to royal soldiers. By morning, Kale would learn that one of his strongest allied packs had openly defied him, and for the first time since Elara vanished, the kingdom would begin choosing sides. By the 3rd morning after Elara's disappearance, Blackthorn no longer looked like a kingdom recovering from scandal. It looked like a kingdom being slowly abandoned by the very people who had once held its walls together. Silvercrest had sealed its borders, Ashvale had suspended winter grain, and 2 eastern packs had returned Kale's diplomatic seals unopened, each message written with the same deliberate insult. They would recognize no new Luna while the moon seal remained dark. Kale read the letters in silence, but the real wound was not political. It was the bracelet hidden inside his fist, the one engraved with the names Orin and Lyra, names that had begun to feel less like a mystery and more like an accusation. Vesta's warning repeated in his mind with merciless precision. Elara might not have left alone, and for the first time since the Blood Moon ceremony, the scar beneath Kale's ribs hurt less than the possibility that his wife had stood bleeding before him while carrying his children, and he had chosen to turn back toward another woman's crown. He ordered the Royal Medicine Archive sealed before Malrek could reach it and summoned every healer who had treated Elara during the past year, but 3 were already missing, and one was found dead before sunset in a servant's cistern with a crescent-shaped cut burned into her palm. Malrek called it proof that Elara's conspirators were eliminating witnesses, yet Kyle no longer accepted conclusions handed to him so easily. He personally examined the dead healer's quarters and found her shelves stripped of records, except for 1 page wedged behind a cabinet where someone in haste had failed to notice it. The page contained dates, dosages, and a notation beside Elara's name that made Kale's vision narrow. Initial pregnancy signs concealed. Increase Silverthorn gradually. He read the line twice before turning toward the guard captain and ordering the chamber locked. Someone had known. Someone inside Blackthorn had known Elara might already be pregnant and had chosen not only to hide it, but to increase the poison until the child or children would be lost before she ever understood what her body was trying to protect. Seraphine entered before Kale called for her, dressed in pale ceremonial silver as though the kingdom were not collapsing around them, and when she saw the paper in his hand, she stopped just 1 step too far from the table. That hesitation was enough. Kale asked whether she had ever entered the royal medicine chamber during Elara's treatment, and Seraphine answered with wounded outrage, accusing him of allowing guilt to make him suspicious of the only person who had stood beside him when Elara betrayed Blackthorn. Kale did not raise his voice. He simply placed the page between them and asked why the notation about hidden pregnancy signs was dated 11 days before Elara's arrest. Seraphine's eyes moved to the paper and then back to him, and for the first time the mask slipped not into fear but irritation, as though the question itself offended her. Even if she was pregnant, she said, what would it have changed? She was still accused of treason. Cale's expression hardened, because that answer contained knowledge she had not been given. He crossed the distance between them slowly and asked the question again, this time without room for evasion. How long did you know? Seraphine's breathing changed, but instead of denying it, she laughed once under her breath, bitter and exhausted, as though secrecy had become more inconvenient than dangerous. She told him she had known before Elara did, because one of the healers had reported the first signs directly to her while Cale was still campaigning in the north. She insisted she had hidden the news only because Elara would have used the pregnancy to manipulate him, to silence the investigation, to bind the throne to a woman who had already failed Blackthorn politically. Cale stared at her with a stillness more threatening than rage, because Seraphine was speaking about unborn children as though they were weapons in a council dispute. When he demanded to know who ordered the increased silverthorn, she refused to answer, but her refusal had already become its own confession. Far from Blackthorn, Elara was recovering beneath the stone roofs of Silvercrest, though recovery felt too generous a word for the fragile truce her body had reached with the poison. Mara and the Silvercrest healer checked both heartbeats several times a day, and while the stronger rhythm had steadied, the weaker one still disappeared beneath long stretches of terrifying silence before returning faintly. Elara never asked which child was weaker, because she feared giving either of them a name in her mind would make the possibility of loss unbearable. Yet at night her fingers rested over her abdomen, as though she could shield both lives from what had already reached them. Ronan offered to send riders across the Allied territories and publicly declare her pregnancy, believing the truth would force Cale to withdraw the arrest order, but Elara refused. If Blackthorn knew she carried 2 royal heirs, she would stop being a fugitive and become something more dangerous, a woman every faction in the kingdom had reason to possess. The danger proved her right before dusk. A Silvercrest patrol captured a stranger attempting to enter the healer's compound through the eastern ravine, carrying no clan colors, no identification, and a narrow blade coated with sleeproot rather than poison. Rowan searched him and found a folded command sealed with the mark of the new Luna. The wording was brutally precise. Elara was expendable, but the children were to be recovered alive. Elara read the order once and felt a colder terror than she had known even in the Blood Moon Hall, because murder she could understand. This was worse. Someone did not merely want her dead. They wanted her children separated from her, carried back to Blackthorn, and raised beneath another woman's name. Ronan cursed Seraphine aloud, but Elara studied the seal instead. It was genuine. The same ring, now worn by her sister, had authorized the order, which meant Seraphine had moved beyond stealing a title or husband and had begun preparing to steal a future that had not yet been born. Under interrogation, the assassin resisted until Rowan placed the captured order beside him and told him Silvercrest had no obligation to honor Blackthorn law. The man finally admitted that the command had come through one of Malrek's private messengers, but Seraphine's seal had been used to make the retrieval legal once the children crossed the border. He also revealed something Elara had not expected. The order specifically forbade killing both infants because one must remain for succession. That phrase changed the shape of the entire conspiracy. Elara realized the children were not simply proof of Cale's bloodline, they were leverage. If she died and one child survived under Seraphine's control, the new Luna could present herself as the guardian of Blackthorn's legitimate heir, securing her own power even if Cale later turned against her. Elara folded the order with deliberate care and told Rowan they would no longer hide evidence. From that moment forward, every lie sent against her would be preserved, copied, and carried to the Pax that still remembered who she had been before Blackthorn taught itself to call her traitor. Cale reached a similar conclusion through a different trail. He discovered that every medical order concerning Elara had passed through the office of Luna Regent, an emergency authority he had granted Seraphine during the Northern Campaign because Elara's recurrent illness kept her from several council meetings. The memory struck him with sickening clarity. He had signed the document himself, trusting Seraphine because Elara trusted her. That authority gave Seraphine access to medicine, servants, sealed correspondence, and the ceremonial Luna seal used to create the forged Western Gate orders. Cale summoned Malrek, and demanded to know why no one had disclosed the regent's access during the treason inquiry. But the elder calmly replied that the council had been focused on protecting the kingdom, not satisfying a husband's emotional doubts. The insult nearly cost Malrek his throat, yet Kael stopped himself before drawing his sword, because rage, without proof, had already destroyed enough. That night, Seraphine entered Kael's chamber without permission, and found him burning copies of the warrants against Elara. She accused him of weakness, then of betrayal, then finally of choosing a woman who had abandoned him over the Luna who remained at his side. Kael asked whether she had ordered Elara's children taken alive. Seraphine did not answer immediately, and silence became more damning than any confession. At last she said that Blackthorn needed heirs under control, not hidden inside enemy territory, and that Elara had forfeited the right to decide their future when she fled. Kael moved so quickly that Seraphine struck the wall before understanding he had crossed the room, his hand closing around her throat just tightly enough to erase the confidence from her face. "They are not your heirs," he said, each word low and lethal. "They are not your bargaining pieces, and if you touch them before they were even born, there is nowhere in this kingdom I will not drag the truth out of you." Seraphine's fear lasted only a second before something uglier replaced it. "You want the truth?" she whispered when he released her. "Then ask yourself why Elara never told you." The words hit exactly where she intended. Kael stepped back, but Seraphine pressed forward, reminding him that Elara had chosen disappearance over trust, that she had left without telling him she carried his children, and that whatever guilt now consumed him did not erase the fact that his wife had hidden the heirs of Blackthorn. Kael almost accepted the accusation until memory answered for him. Elara had been chained, humiliated, bleeding, denied a private hearing, and dragged away while he completed Seraphine's coronation. For the first time he understood that Elara had not withheld the truth from the husband she trusted. She had withheld it from the king, who had proven she could no longer trust him. Before dawn, Kael left Blackthorn with 6 riders and no council escort, following reports that Silvercrest patrols had intercepted royal hunters near the northern pass. By midday, he found the remains of a struggle beside a ruined chapel and recognized Rowan's blade marks in the snow. Farther north, a Silvercrest scout warned him to turn back, but Kael crossed the border anyway and rode until he saw the healer's compound beyond the pines. He dismounted before the gates, prepared for arrest, prepared for Ronan's anger, prepared even for Elara's hatred. What he was not prepared for was the sight through an open courtyard window. Elara standing beside Mara with one hand braced against a table, the other resting over a stomach that, beneath the loose gray dress, was beginning to show the unmistakable curve of pregnancy. Kael stopped breathing. Mara pressed a listening horn beneath Elara's abdomen while Rowan stood nearby, and after several unbearable seconds the healer's face softened. "Both are still there," she said. "The weaker heartbeat has returned." Kael heard every word from the courtyard. "Both. Not one child." Tfo. Elara turned at the sound of his boots against the stone, and when her eyes met his, there was no relief in them. No instinctive step toward him. No fragment of the woman who had once crossed battlefields just to make sure he was still alive. There was only recognition, guarded and cold, sharpened by everything he had done since the Blood Moon Hall. Kael's gaze dropped helplessly to her stomach, then to the folded paper in Rowan's hand bearing Seraphine's seal. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King looked afraid to speak. Kael had imagined 100 versions of the moment he would finally stand before Elara again, yet none of them had prepared him for the silence that greeted him inside the Silvercrest Hall. Ronan's warriors lined the stone walls with hands resting near their swords. Rowan stood beside Elara like a man prepared to die before letting the Alpha King take one more step, and Mara remained close enough to catch Elara, if the weakness in her legs returned. Kael stopped several paces away because even he understood that crossing the distance without permission would be another violation, and for the first time since he had inherited Blackthorn, authority gave him nothing. Elara looked thinner, paler, and colder than the woman he had last seen bleeding on the floor of the Blood Moon Hall. Yet the curve beneath her gray dress held more power over him than any army. He tried to speak her name, but she raised one hand and placed the captured order bearing Seraphine's seal on the table between them, forcing him to look first at the command that declared her expendable and her unborn children property to be recovered for succession. Kael read the order with a face that seemed to lose years and then gain them all at once, while Elara watched without softening. He said he had not authorized it, and she answered that she already knew, because the poison had taught her how many people could hide behind a royal seal while the king remained too comfortable to ask who was using it. That sentence cut deeper than accusation because it was true in ways he could no longer deny. Kael admitted that Seraphine had known about the pregnancy before Elara herself, and that the records proved the medicine had been deliberately altered. But when he tried to say he would make everything right, Elara's expression hardened with such controlled fury that even Ronan turned slightly away. "Make what right?" she asked. "The poison, the chains, the crown on my sister's head? Or the moment I bled at your feet and you decided the ceremony mattered more than whether I was carrying your child?" Kael opened his mouth, but no defense survived the memory. Elara stepped closer and delivered the question he had been dreading since the night he found her empty chamber. "When they forced me to my knees, what exactly were you protecting?" He could have lied, could have blamed Malrek, the forged evidence, the ambush that had left him furious and wounded, or the council threatening civil war if he hesitated, but every excuse would have insulted the woman standing before him. "The crown," he said at last. The admission spread through the hall with more weight than a confession of murder, because everyone present understood what it meant. Elara's throat moved as though she had swallowed something sharp, yet no tears came. She simply nodded once, as if Kael had finally confirmed the answer she already carried inside her. "Then do not ask me to trust the man who chose a crown while his wife was bleeding." Kael lowered his head, and in that terrible moment the Alpha King finally understood that remorse did not reverse a choice. It only forced the person who made it to live long enough to see what that choice had destroyed. A horn screamed from the outer wall before anyone could answer, followed by the pounding of boots and the arrival of a messenger whose armor was blackened by smoke. He collapsed to one knee before Ronan and reported that Blackthorn had closed its gates, the western garrison had turned on the royal guard, and Seraphine had declared Kael mentally compromised by the traitor Luna. High Elder Malrek had summoned the council in Kael's absence and transferred emergency authority to the new Luna regent, while 3 noble houses had already sworn loyalty to her. Worse, children from dissenting families had been taken into the palace under the language of protective custody, giving Seraphine hostages against any pack that considered rebellion. Kael's face changed from shame to murderous clarity, because the structure he had protected at Elara's expense was now being used exactly as she had warned it could be used. He had given Seraphine access, Malrek legitimacy, and the council enough fear to turn his own kingdom against him. Kael prepared to leave immediately, but Ronan blocked the doors and told him Silvercrest would not bleed to repair Blackthorn's mistake. Kael did not argue. He merely said he would go with 6 riders and die at the gates if necessary. That should have ended the matter, yet Elara turned toward the messenger and asked how many children had been taken. 23, including the young daughter of Ashvale's Alpha, and 2 boys whose father had refused to recognize Seraphine as Luna. Elara closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, the decision was already there. She would return. Not for Kael, not for the throne, and not because Blackthorn had earned her loyalty, but because innocent children were now paying for an ambition they had never chosen. Ronan objected that travel could endanger both unborn heirs, but Elara answered with a bitterness that silenced him. "If I hide while other mothers lose their children to a war built around my name, then Seraphine has already made me into the woman she accused me of being." By nightfall, Silvercrest riders were moving south beneath moonless clouds, joined by Ashvale warriors and smaller packs that had refused Seraphine's rule. Elara traveled inside a reinforced carriage with Mara, while Kael rode beside it without once asking to enter. He could hear the wheels grinding over frozen ground and knew every jolt might threaten the lives inside. Yet he also knew he had lost the right to command her return. Near dawn, they reached Blackthorn's northern ridge and saw smoke rising from the lower city. The palace banners had been replaced by Seraphine's silver crescent, and rows of archers watched from the battlements. Malrek's forces had prepared for a siege, but they had not expected Elara to arrive openly. When she stepped from the carriage wearing no crown and no ceremonial robe, the soldiers on the wall began murmuring, because the woman they had been told was hiding in disgrace now stood visibly pregnant between the armies of 3 allied packs. The gates opened only after Malrek sent word that Seraphine demanded a public parley inside the Blood Moon Hall, and Elara accepted before Kael could object. The same corridor where she had been dragged in chains now filled with soldiers on both sides, each step carrying her closer to the place where her humiliation had begun. When the doors opened, Seraphine was seated on the Luna throne beneath banners bearing her own crest, while Malrek stood beside her with armed elders and hostages lined behind the dais. The sight of Elara alive stripped the color from Seraphine's face for a heartbeat, but she recovered quickly and smiled. "You always did have a talent for surviving things meant to finish you," she said. Elara did not answer, because the room itself was already answering for her. Priests lowered their heads as she passed, palace wolves strained toward her from the courtyard, and the dormant silver lines carved through the floor began glowing faintly beneath her steps. Seraphine saw it and snapped that Elara had corrupted the old magic. But the accusation died when the moon seal, carried into the hall by the temple priests, suddenly flared bright enough to throw every face into silver light. The crowd recoiled. Malrek shouted for the seal to be removed, yet it burned brighter as Elara approached, then went cold the instant Seraphine stretched out her hand. For the first time, several elders openly stepped away from the new Luna. Elara looked at her sister and said with devastating calm, "You can steal a robe, a ring, a room, even a husband's trust, but you cannot force a kingdom to recognize what it never chose." Seraphine's control finally cracked. She rose from the throne and screamed that Elara had ruined everything simply by refusing to die, and the hall went still because the confession had come too quickly for Malrek to stop it. Kale took one step forward, but Malrek immediately ordered the hostages brought closer to the dais and placed a blade against the throat of Ashvale's young daughter. He revealed that Seraphine's public cruelty had always been useful, but the true objective was control of succession. A weak Luna, a divided king, and children whose legitimacy could be manipulated would allow the council to rule Blackthorn for another generation. Seraphine stared at him in disbelief, finally realizing that the power she had traded her sister for had never actually belonged to her. Malrek then demanded Kael surrender his crown or watch the children die one by one. The trap was complete. The throne Kael had once protected at Elara's expense now demanded another sacrifice in front of him. This time, Kael did not hesitate. He removed the alpha crown from his head and let it strike the marble floor. The sound shattered the room. Malrek's smile appeared for only a second before Kael drew his sword and drove it through the elder's nearest guard, while Rowan and Ronan's warriors surged forward from the doors. The hall erupted into steel, screams, and overturned braziers. Seraphine tried to flee toward the private passage, but Elara blocked her path, not with a weapon but with the captured order, bearing the seal used to claim her children. She held it up between them and demanded to know whether Seraphine truly intended to take two infants from their mother and raise them beneath a stolen crown. Seraphine's face twisted with years of buried resentment. "If you had died when you were supposed to," she spat, "I would never have needed to." The confession struck the hall harder than the fighting. Kael heard it. So did every elder still standing. Seraphine seemed to understand too late what she had admitted, but desperation made her reckless. She seized a ceremonial dagger from the altar and lunged toward Elara's abdomen. Rowan was too far away. Kael was locked against two guards. Ronan shouted a warning, but Elara twisted aside just enough that the blade missed her stomach and tore across her ribs. Blood darkened her dress. Seraphine attacked again, shrieking that the heirs should have belonged to her future, but this time Elara caught her wrist and drove her backward into the Luna throne. The crown fell from Seraphine's head and rolled across the marble until it stopped at Elara's feet. Then Seraphine laughed, not because she was winning, because she still had one weapon left. She turned toward the side chamber and ordered a nurse to come forward. A woman emerged holding an infant wrapped in blackthorn, black, and silver. The battle faltered into stunned silence. Seraphine took the child into her arms and lifted him before the entire hall. "You all want an heir?" she demanded. "Then look at him." Kael stared at the infant, as if the world had shifted beneath him. Seraphine's smile returned, broken and triumphant at once. "He carries Blackthorn blood." Elara felt every eye turn toward Kael. For one horrifying moment, even she did not know what that meant. Mara pushed through the guards, examined the child's birthmark beneath his shoulder, and went pale. It was the ancient wolf-shaped mark carried only by direct males of Kael's bloodline. Seraphine laughed again and whispered, "Now tell them whose children matter." Kael's face became almost unrecognizable, but the oldest priest stepped closer, studied the infant, then looked directly at Seraphine. "That child carries Blackthorn blood," he said. A pause followed, but not the Alpha Kings. The hall froze, and somewhere beneath Seraphine's fury, fear finally appeared. The priest's words did not merely silence the Blood Moon Hall. They split it open. Seraphine's fingers tightened around the infant until the child whimpered, and the sound seemed to drag every person in the room out of shock at once. Kael stood motionless beside the fallen Alpha Crown, staring first at the boy's wolf-shaped birthmark, and then at Seraphine with an expression so cold that even Malrek's remaining guards began backing away. The priest repeated that the child carried direct Blackthorn blood but not Kael's, and this time Malrek's composure finally cracked. Seraphine shouted that the priest was lying, yet Mara had already crossed the hall and uncovered a second mark beneath the infant's shoulder, a crescent scar unique to the younger branch of Kael's family. Kael knew that mark. His younger brother, Darius, had carried the same one before dying in the Northern War 2 years earlier. The realization struck him with such force that he seemed to forget the battle still burning around him, because Darius had died without wife, without acknowledged heir, and without ever telling Kael that the woman now wearing Elara's stolen crown had once carried his child. Seraphine's face twisted between panic and fury as the truth began tearing through the story she had built. She had known Darius before he left for war, had met him secretly, while Elara believed her younger sister was simply lonely in the palace, and had become pregnant shortly before he died. Malrek discovered the pregnancy before anyone else, and immediately understood what it could become. A hidden child of Blackthorn blood, born outside the line of succession, could be transformed into a political weapon if Elara were discredited, and Kael left without acknowledged heirs. Seraphine had initially hidden the child out of fear, but grief curdled into ambition when Malrek convinced her that Darius had died because Kael sent him into a hopeless campaign to protect his own throne. He offered her revenge disguised as justice, promising that if Elara fell and Seraphine became Luna, her son could one day be presented as Blackthorn's safest successor, should Kael remain childless. Elara stared at her sister in disbelief, not because she could not understand grief, but because Seraphine had taken a dead man's memory and used it to poison the woman who had raised her like family. Kael finally found his voice and asked the question that mattered most, whether Darius had truly died in battle by chance. Malrek's eyes shifted toward the side doors, and that hesitation was enough for Rowan to move. He seized the elder before the old man could reach a hidden blade and dragged him into the center of the hall while Ronan's soldiers finished disarming the last loyalists. Under threat of public trial before every pack, Malrek admitted that Darius had been deliberately sent toward an exposed pass with altered orders because the younger prince had begun questioning the council's control over royal succession and had discovered irregularities in the treatment records of previous Lunas. Malrek had not personally killed him, but he had ensured the battlefield did. Seraphine recoiled as though struck. The man she had trusted to avenge Darius had actually helped engineer his death, and every cruelty she committed against Elara had strengthened the very system that destroyed the father of her child. For one moment, Seraphine looked broken enough that pity might have been possible, but then her eyes fell on Elara's rounded stomach and hardened again. Instead of turning on Malrek, she accused Elara of ruining everything simply by surviving. She screamed that if the poison had worked, if the twins had died, if Elara had disappeared quietly into disgrace, her son would have had a future no one could challenge. The confession destroyed the last excuse available to her. Grief had not forced her to order Elara's unborn children taken alive. Malrek had not forced her to stand in Elara's wedding robe while guards pressed her sister into the floor. Seraphine had made choices, again and again, whenever ambition offered something cruelty could buy. Elara stepped toward her, despite the blood still spreading along her ribs, and said with a steadiness that cut deeper than shouting, "You keep speaking as if my life was the obstacle between you and happiness. But I gave you a home when you had none, protected you when the court mocked you, trusted you beside my husband, and you answered every kindness by measuring how much easier my death would make your life." The infant began crying harder, and for the first time Seraphine looked down at him as something other than an heir. That moment almost shattered her, but Elara did not let the child become another weapon. She crossed the distance, took the baby carefully from Seraphine's trembling arms, and handed him to Mara. "He did not poison me," Elara said. "He did not steal my crown. He did not choose any of this." The words stripped Seraphine of the final defense she had built around motherhood. Elara would not punish an innocent child for his mother's betrayal, and that mercy became more humiliating than vengeance because it exposed how far Seraphine herself had fallen. Kael ordered her arrested, but when 2 guards approached, she dropped suddenly toward the fallen ceremonial dagger and lunged again. Not for Elara this time, but for the infant in Mara's arms, screaming that no one would take her son from her. Rowan intercepted her before she crossed 2 steps, twisting the weapon from her hand and forcing her to the floor, exactly where Elara had once been forced to kneel. The reversal was so complete that no one in the hall moved. Seraphine knelt bleeding and disheveled beneath the throne she had stolen, while Elara stood above her without a crown, and somehow looked more sovereign than anyone else in the room. Malrek was dragged beside her in chains, and the surviving elders were ordered to remain for a public judgment before the allied pacts. The trial did not wait for another day, because Kael refused to let the truth disappear behind private negotiations again. Before sunset, the forged letters, medicine ledgers, witness payments, regent orders, assassination command, and records of Darius's altered military route were laid out across the same ceremonial table where Elara's guilt had once been declared without proper examination. One by one, healers, guards, servants, and captured messengers testified. Every lie that had pushed Elara toward disgrace now returned as evidence against the people who built it. Malrek was sentenced to death for treason, conspiracy, murder, and manipulation of succession. The council houses that participated in the plot lost their hereditary seats, their private armies were dissolved, and their lands were placed under pack review rather than royal seizure, so Kael could not simply replace one concentration of power with another. Seraphine's punishment was different. Kael initially demanded execution, but Elara stopped him, not to protect her sister, but because death would allow Seraphine to escape the consequences too quickly. She was stripped of the Luna title, royal privileges, property, and claim to Blackthorn's succession, then sentenced to permanent confinement at the northern fortress under neutral pack supervision. Her son would not be punished for her crimes. He would be acknowledged publicly as Darius's child, but excluded from political manipulation until adulthood, with Elara named one of his legal protectors so no faction could erase or exploit him again. Then the hall turned toward Kael. He could have ended the judgment there. He was still Alpha King. Malrek had been exposed. Seraphine had been condemned. Every convenient villain stood in chains. Instead, Kael walked to the center of the hall and ordered Rowan to read aloud the record of the Blood Moon coronation, including the command that had forced Elara to kneel. Rowan hesitated, but Kael repeated the order. The words echoed beneath the ancient pillars. The former Luna refused submission. The Alpha King commanded the guards to lower her head. Kael removed his sword, placed it on the floor, and looked toward the nobles who had watched Elara bleed while saying nothing. Malrek forged evidence, he said. Seraphine poisoned her, but neither of them forced those words out of my mouth. The order was mine. No one spoke. Kael then walked to the exact place where Elara's knees had struck the marble and lowered himself before her. The Alpha King knelt, not in a private chamber where humiliation could disappear behind closed doors, but before every Alpha, priest, warrior, servant, and council survivor who had witnessed Elara's disgrace. Kael placed the Luna crown on the floor between them, then held out her ring in his open palm. His voice remained steady, but there was nothing regal left in it when he admitted that he had chosen certainty over trust, politics over the woman who had stood beside him, and the safety of his crown over the safety of his bleeding wife. He asked for no immediate forgiveness. He only asked permission to spend whatever years remained, proving that the man who failed her that night did not have to remain the man standing before her now. Elara looked at the ring for a long time. Then she reached down. The hall seemed to breathe again, but she did not take it. She took only the Luna crown. "You can return a title," she said quietly. "You can clear my name, restore my chambers, rewrite every record they poisoned. But you cannot hand me back the woman who entered this hall believing her husband would never be the one to humiliate her." Kael closed his fingers around the ring. The refusal did more damage than shouting ever could, because it left him with something punishment could not resolve quickly. Elara accepted the crown because Blackthorn's laws needed rebuilding, and the Pax needed a Luna who had survived the system meant to erase her, but she refused to let the kingdom mistake restoration of office for restoration of marriage. She demanded a new charter, giving the Luna independent authority over medicine, inheritance, child protection, and council review, specifically removing the Alpha King's power to replace her through a single political decree. Kael agreed without bargaining, and several allied alphas added their seals before the night ended. Months later, both twins survived the pregnancy that Seraphine and Malrek had tried to erase. Oren was born first, fierce and loud, while Lyra arrived smaller but stronger than every healer had feared possible. When the moon seal flared across Blackthorn at their birth, no one dared call Elara barren again. Darius's son remained protected under neutral guardianship, and Elara visited him often enough that people eventually stopped calling him Seraphine's secret and began using his name. Kael was present through the twins' first months, but always by permission. He learned to stand beside Elara without touching her, to ask instead of assume, and to hear silence without interpreting it as obedience. The final reversal came 1 year after the Blood Moon humiliation, when Blackthorn gathered again inside the same hall for the signing of the new pact charter. Seraphine was not there. Far to the north, she lived without servants, titles, or the audience she had once craved. Malrek's name had been removed from the council stone. Kael stood below the dais rather than upon it, while Elara entered carrying Lyra, with Orin in Rowan's arms behind her, and every alpha in the hall rose before the woman they had once watched being forced to her knees. Kael still wore the Luna ring on a chain beneath his shirt. Elara still wore none, and that was the price no court could shorten. Because crowns could be returned before sunset, kingdoms could be rebuilt after war, and even bloodlines could survive poison, but trust destroyed in one deliberate moment could demand years before it dared to live again. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments. Would you have forgiven Kael, or would you have walked away forever? And if you want more Alpha King stories where betrayal comes with a real price, stay with the next story.